Hello, everyone, and welcome to another roundtable discussion about the Christian's response to COVID-19. Today I have with me Pastor Dave Whitelaw and Pastor Matt Maw, and we're going to tackle the subjects of, is the COVID-19 pandemic God's judgment on the world? And what should we do with the anxiety we feel surrounding our own health and the economy? And then what should we do with all our free time? How do we redeem this time? So let's start off with the hard one. Is COVID-19 God's judgment on the world? What do you think?
I'll take that, and that's a good question. And certainly it is a question that I think that a lot of Christians are thinking about, and a lot of people in the world that may have spiritual kind of sensitivity are thinking about. And the more I processed that question, the more I was thinking that there's probably an appropriate way of answering that, and I think there is an inappropriate way of answering that question. And so I think in the way that leads us into answering that appropriately, maybe just asking the question, does God judge the world through plagues or things like COVID-19? Right. Does God even do that? And I think if you were to read through the Bible, you'd have to, as you go through the Old Testament and New Testament, you would see that yes, that God does judge the world, and one of the ways he judges the world is through plagues. You see that in the Old Testament in Genesis 5. You see it in when the big one is when he sent the flood down onto the world of Noah. You got Exodus chapter 7 when Moses went into Pharaoh and the 7 plagues, and you see it even in Leviticus 26. God was saying it to Israel that if they don't follow him and if they disobey, that he would send a plague. So you see in the Old Testament against unbelievers and believers. And then you go to the New Testament and you do see it even in the New Testament. Jesus even talked about in the last days that he would send plagues. And it'd be a reminder and a recognition that the world, he's going to return. So I do think we do see God using plagues as a form of judgment. And so the question is COVID-19 a means of God's judgment on the world? And I think I would answer it pastorally, in my sense, would say it could be. I'd have to say it could be. God could be judging the world because of the where things are at, and he could be doing that. But I would have to say it could be, not necessarily it is. Because the other side of it is that God this world, we are in a sinful world, and a natural result of a sinful world are diseases, right, and pestilence and all of these things. So whether God is doing it, like causing it, or it's just happening because it's a natural result, I don't know. And I don't know if we do know. And that's where I think if we were to say God is doing that, that's where I think it may be dangerous to say and presume that God is doing something that maybe he's not. I think a good question to ask or to process is, there's probably 3 responses in thinking about this question. One response I think we ought to cause us to do is ask the question, are we in the end times? Which is another whole video I think we could do.
I agree.
Are we in the end times? And I think the answer, a very simple answer, is yes, we are. I mean, we're closer to the end times today than yesterday. Right. And as Christians, well, I think one of the things this should cause us to do is ask that question and think about that. Are we in the end times? Is God, and what do the end times look like? And what is God, Jesus say about how we could recognize the end times? And certainly this is one of them. Wars and rumors of war and disease and all of these things. So as Christians, I do think we need to be asking that question. Yes. And I do think we need to be wrestling through this. If we're not, I would be as bold as to say, maybe we're not as focused on God as we ought to be. Or maybe we're not focused on heaven as we ought to be, because we should be thinking about these questions. So then the question is what should we be thinking about if it is God judging, or if it is if we're in the end times? And I think that God's purpose in all of this is to wake us up. Whenever God does any form of judgment, and the purpose of Jesus telling us that the end times are coming is for us to be woken up and to wake up and to be sensitive to the times. So as Christians, I think this should be causing us to be sensitive.
Absolutely.
Spiritually, our own life, our own walk with Jesus. Are we following Jesus? Is the church following Jesus? Where are we? Where's Jesus in our life? I think those are some of those questions that we personally ought to be wrestling with. And then another thing that God uses as far as the judgment and end times is, are we living out the mission that Jesus has given us to go and make disciples? Are we sharing Jesus to our neighbors? Because that is what we ought to be doing in the days that we live here on earth. So I think those are the two questions we need to wrestle with. Are we woken up? Is this causing us to wake up spiritually? And are we living on mission? I think that's kind of where the response to this ought to be leading us.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, even in realizing, as you said prior, just talking about how it's both God's judgment, but also a result of human sin. And in Genesis 3, we see that God judges the earth and curses the earth because of the sin of humanity. And so it's by the sweat of his brow and thorns in the field that he will work. And so to realize that the outflow of human sin causes destruction. We see that in Romans 8, right? That the earth itself is groaning for redemption.
Right.
And it's groaning because it's under bondage because of human sin. And so whether or not we see God directly behind COVID-19 or a few steps back in being behind the one who is behind it, we see that God ultimately is in control, but God has purposed this for a reason. It's not some random occurrence. I think that's one of the dangers when we say that God isn't behind COVID-19, is that we think that it's a random occurrence that's entered into human history and it has no purpose and it can only destroy what we value. And so to see that ultimately behind this is God, whether it's a result of human sin or if God has used this to judge specifically, I think it's helpful to hold those things in balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with the onset of increased social restrictions and more cases, every day you hear more cases. There's so much anxiety around health and around finances. I know a lot of people are being laid off. Can you speak to that? How do we deal with that as Christians in a biblical way?
Yeah. So I think when we talk about anxiety over these things like work and finances and even health, we really get to a question that I think Dave actually pointed towards is where our values lie. And I think it's easy to look back even a month ago and say that the things that made us feel secure and safe and even a sense of fullness were things like health and safety, things like financial security, that these things gave us a fullness of life. I think the Bible challenges this throughout the Bible. Yesterday I was actually drawn to Ecclesiastes to read through it, and I just noticed in a few spots in chapters 5 and 6 it talks about finances and how those who are rich, their riches when they die essentially turn to nothing, and they can lose that money at a blink of an eye. And so they in themselves are meaningless. They're valueless. It talks about work in chapter 2, our toil, and how we toil and toil and toil, but somebody else benefits. And we toil and toil and toil, but we die anyways. And again, meaningless. Throughout the book, there's this idea that death is coming indiscriminately for all. And so it doesn't matter our physical health today, but we know our end. And so really the book itself poses this question: what good is it then to be righteous if death comes indiscriminately, if everything that we put our hand to is utterly meaningless? What good is there being wise if death comes indiscriminately and everything is ultimately meaningless? A Christian psychologist who I love, he writes about these three things as being sort of issues when it comes to anxiety. We have an incredible anxiety over guilt. We have an incredible anxiety over meaninglessness and an incredible anxiety over death. And you could probably see death as sort of this health security issue. He talks about how we find in Jesus Christ freedom from guilt, that Jesus undergoes anxiety in the garden. Jesus undergoes anxiety on the cross for the sake of our guilt and frees us from that. Jesus gives our lives incredible meaning, overcoming death and destruction and evil, and gives us purpose for life that extends into eternity. And then finally, that victory over death that we experience in Jesus through the resurrection. So we as Christians have this hope, and yet we recognize that all of those things are certainly evils in our world. Ecclesiastes realizes that. It says that when the rich person loses their finances, that is a grievous evil. So I think that we can look at the world, we can see these plummeting stocks, and we can see the death of many as something that should grieve us, and we should say those things are evil, and they should, within us, within people in our world, especially who do not know Jesus, it should cause them great anxiety. But then we should find our hope and freedom in Jesus. That's the end of Ecclesiastes, really. It turns us and says, instead of fearing the meaninglessness of life and death and destruction and the indiscriminate nature of all that, we're to fear God. And God in our lives brings this meaning as we sort of mentioned in the cross. So when we find that, I think that it turns us, maybe brings up concern in our life, not for things like finances, not for things like wealth, not for the confusion and bewilderment that we exist in right now. But I think it should bring an anxiety for the lost, who currently exist in that state without hope, without real hope. The stocks will rise, right. They already are, but they'll crash again. Yeah. And COVID will be figured out, but something else will come, and all of us will die. So the anxieties of life will always be there. We were anxious about our finances before COVID. Right. We were anxious about our health before COVID. Right. More so now, but we're just gaining a clearer picture of what's really going on. And so if our hope isn't in the one who doesn't change, in the one who is timeless, we'll constantly just be fluctuating. And so we need to fear God, obey His commandments, stand on what is firm. And yeah, I think that that's a great encouragement to say, your anxieties are about real things, but realize that when we place our hope and trust in Jesus Christ, in God our Father, and live by His Spirit, and turn to our neighbors and say, we have the answer for your anxiety. Because I was anxious too, and I know hope in the hopelessness. Yeah, good point. And I think we always have been without those the securities of finances and all those things that we think we had. Really, we didn't. They were never what held us and kept us firm and secure. Right. And I know for me, whenever, and anxiety is just a normal part of life. We're all going to deal with that. It's not a bad thing to be anxious, but to know how to combat it with truth and to focus back in on God, like you said, is so important. To take those deep breaths, take the moment out, sing that praise song, read that scripture, how beautiful are your courts, O God. I just long for them. Put your focus on something else. Yeah, that's a great segue into my next question is, how do we redeem this time? We're most of us are isolated in our homes. We can't get together with our neighbors. How do we take this time and make it be good stewards for the kingdom of God? How do we reach our neighbors with this message? What are some ideas that you have about how we can redeem the time?
Yeah, I could add some to that. But let me maybe ask the negative first, then I'll go to the positive. The negative is what's the worst thing we could do in this time? And I think one of the worst things we could do in this time is, in the void of it, just continue to do what we normally do. Let's continue to watch TV like we always do. Let's continue to do some of the things that our normal patterns. I think one of the greatest ways to redeem this time is, what is it that we have been missing? And I think one of the greatest things that God has offered us in this moment right now is the slowing down.
Yes.
Yeah.
And almost this natural worldwide pause,
Yeah.
right? Of Sabbath. You can
Yes.
even say we now have a month or however long this is going
Right.
to be of Sabbath kind of reflection,
Yeah.
pondering
Yeah.
on the things of God. I think it'd be a waste to just fill it up our emptiness of the
Yes.
time and with things that we normally do. Let's try to say, hey, we have an opportunity here that we may not ever get again, or we may have an opportunity here to build habits right now that will carry us through our life. So again, I do think, spiritually speaking, dig into God's word. I think, using this time to even ponder and think, get away. I also think one of the greatest things we could do in this time is connect with people.
Definitely.
It's one of the greatest things we have opportunity for right now is to connect with people. And we have various different means and methods of doing that. Phone, Facebook, Instagram, all of these kind of things on technology offers us. That's what we need to be doing. And both inside the church and outside the church.
Yeah.
And
so practical ways of maybe getting out and meeting those neighbors that you've never had time to meet before. What are some ways that we can get out and do that? Now, I know on my street, I don't know if it's the same. It probably depends on where you live, but everybody's out for walks. Like everybody's stir crazy. So in the middle of a rainy day, for that 10 minutes if there's no rain, everybody is out on the street.
Yeah.
Like it's really easy to meet your neighbors and start up a conversation. How are you doing with this?
Yeah.
Like, did you still have a job? Or how can I help? Or hey, I'm on this number on the street. Like being intentional and maybe making a Facebook group for your neighborhood, or just saying, hey, I can help if you are locked in. Like, can I get groceries for you? Here's my number. Or come knock on my door. Can I pray for you?
Yeah.
I know there's some controversy about passing out physical "can I pray for you" cards, but even just meeting your neighbors and saying, I would love to pray for you, come knock on my door and let me know, or Facebook me and let me know. What do you think, Matt? What are some ways that we can redeem this time?
I think that's great. And like you say, it's kind of confusing because you're not entirely sure what is okay, what's not okay, and in a few days what's okay right now might not be okay tomorrow. But yeah, I think like even little cards in mailboxes that just say like, hey, if you need food, let me know. Or even just drop off some food, like if you have some extra canned beans or something. Even just a small gesture like that, just to say like, first and foremost, I care about you and I want to be able to meet whatever needs we can. There's definitely shelters in all of our cities that could use a little bit of help. And so I'm sure just reaching out to some of those nonprofits would be a really beneficial move.
There's an app, I don't know if you've heard about it, but Nextdoor, it's called Nextdoor, that you can download. And actually, if people in your neighborhood have downloaded it, you can actually communicate and talk and through that app.
That's great.
And it shows you kind of that area. And it is a neat way of just saying, hey, anyone out of whatever or anyone need this, and to connect that way. And it's a natural platform where people outside of the church are using it. So it's a neat way there. You don't have to force yourself into it. It's just you can go onto it as just a neighbor, right? So
that's cool.
Wouldn't it be so great at the end of this if the Christians had stepped up to the plate so much that they were the leaders in their neighborhood and the leaders around the world saying, hey, let's make positive out of this. Let me help you. We're the ones who are gonna, come to your door when you need us, or caring for you. The ones leading the way. It would be such a great testimony. And I know we're in a post-Christian time, so we can't really assume that everybody wants to hear the gospel in first conversation. I think that's the wrong way to go. But to build those friendships and those relationships, those are the really key, important things. And what better way to do that when we have a common crisis? It brings people together, right? There's a great verse, actually a couple of great verses, but in Hebrews it says, we don't belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but we have faith and are saved. And 2 Timothy 1:7 says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Let's go into this remembering who we are and who we're called to be, and not shrinking back from the opportunities, and asking God to give us wisdom and be harmless as doves but shrewd as serpents. Thanks guys for your time.
No problem.
Thanks for checking out this video. For more great content, subscribe below.